Where does it start off at? Like at 0, what's the position at 0? Okay. When does the particle change direction? Positive to negative if you're talking about velocity. So this is the sort of the position graph. So we start here, and you got to think about velocity. So velocity is negative until I get to here, right? That just means it's going backwards until I get there. So it changes direction at 3. If you press 3, you can see that. What's the y value at 3?
-5.
Okay. So we started at 4. We went all the way to -5. Does it change direction again after that? No, because from there velocity is positive, the slope is positive. We're trying to figure out the position from 0 to 6, so let's figure out what's going on at 6. And 6 is 22. So we started at 4. We went backwards to -5. So how far did we travel from 0 to 3? 9. Because we went 4 and went 5 more. Does that make sense? Okay, so we went 9 all the way to 3. And then how much did we go from 3 to 6? 27. So the actual distance traveled would be? Okay. Number 2. Is there a time during 0 to 12 when the particle is at rest? There's a theorem that goes along with it, and I briefly mentioned the theorem, but just looking at the numbers, do you think there's a time between 0 and 12?
Yeah.
About what time would it be? Or in what interval would it be? Somewhere right in here? Because if the particle is going to be at rest, then velocity is going to be 0, right? And for me to go from -3 to 2, I'm going to have to go through 0. Do you agree? Okay. The answer is yes. And the theorem that says that if you have a negative value and you have a positive value and the function's continuous, that it's going to have to go through that thing in between, that is called the intermediate value theorem. It's kind of it just makes sense that that's true. If I had the velocity was 2 and the velocity was 10, I know it's going to have to go through 8 to get from 2 to 10. It might go through 8 and come back down and come back up. It might do crazy stuff, but I can't get to 10 without going through 8. In this case, I can't get from -3 to 2 without going through 0 because it's continuous. Does that make sense? Okay. Next question. It says use data from the table to find an approximation for v prime of 10 and explain the meaning. Okay, so they give us velocity in the problem, and they're asking for v prime of 10. Tell me just v prime of 10, what does that even mean?
That's going to be the acceleration.
So it's asking about acceleration at 10, right? If I know what velocity is, and I'm trying to find acceleration or the next derivative, what's one way that I could estimate what it would be? If I wanted to estimate slope, what would I do?
You take the distance over time.
Like I would do the y's over the x's and divide, right? Okay, go back at the table. Where would 10 be located? So 10 is here somewhere. If I wanted to estimate the derivative at 10, I'm going to estimate it using slope. And so I'm just going to find the slope there between the 8 and the 12 because that's the only values that I have that's close to what I'm talking about. So in order for me to estimate v prime of 10, I'm just going to do the slope. I'm going to do 5 minus 7 over 12 minus 8, I get negative 2/4 or negative 1/2. All right. We know that velocity is in meters per minute and time is in minutes. So we did meters per minute divided by minutes. 5 minus 7 was velocity. That's why it's meters per minute. 12 minus 8 was time. That's minutes. So those units are meters per minute squared if you want to write it that way. And it represents the acceleration. So it's the acceleration at 10. Okay. Number 4. Is there guaranteed to be a time in the interval from 0 to 12 such that A of C equals 0? So is there a time between 0 and 12 that if I found the slope that I'm going to get 0? That's what it's asking you. See, 6 and 12, if I found the slope between 6 and 12, I'm going to get 0. So it seems that as the acceleration is going to have to be 0 somewhere around in there. What theorem is that tells me that? I spent more time on that theorem.
Mean value?
Yeah. So, yes, between 6 and 12. And the reason is the MVT. Intermediate value theorem says that if you have y values, that you could go from one y value to another, as long as it's continuous. Mean value theorem says that if you find the slope, that somewhere between there has the same slope. You won't see these two things often, but I have seen them usually on like a free response kind of question on the AP test. This particular 1 through, how many ever there is, there's 4, there might be something on the back. 4 of them. This whole 1 through 4 might be one free response question. We're going to be doing some more soon. And so like, it's all the free response questions are worth 9 points. So they would have assigned like maybe 1 point for 1, 2 points for 2, 3 points for 3, and 3 points for 4 or something like that. So that was looking at a table. Example 2 on the back is looking at a graph. So it's another kind of free response question. At t equals 4, is the particle moving to the right or to the left? There's 4. Is the particle moving to the left or the right? Do what? It's not left.
Move it to the right because it's still,
See, this is velocity, right?
but slowing down. It's about to start moving to the left.
Oh, wait a minute. Velocity at 4 is it 6? Yeah. If you find that, that's 6. Okay? And because that is velocity, and I'm just looking at the y value, I'm not looking at the slope, I know that it's moving to the right.
But the acceleration.
Acceleration would have been negative, yeah. But we were asking about what the velocity was doing. So then, number 2, over what time interval is the particle moving to the left? So the particle would be moving to the left when velocity is negative, right? Okay, this graph is velocity. So how do I find when velocity is negative? I'm looking for where it's underneath the x-axis. So what time interval am I going to say? It goes only to 9 for whatever reason. There's nothing after 9, so I'm just going to put 9 like that. And your reason when it says explain your answer is that velocity is negative. Okay, at t equals 4, this was the question we asked earlier, Is the acceleration of the particle positive or negative? It's negative because the slope is negative. So you could say v prime of t is negative, or you could say the slope of v of t is negative. Average acceleration. We're starting with velocity, and we want to find acceleration. If it would have said find the average velocity, because you start with velocity, you would do your integral formula that we learned. Okay? But because we're trying to find the slope of velocity, then our average acceleration just means find the slope between the 2 points. Okay? So on this question number 4, it's asking us to find the slope between 2 and 4. And you can use your table or your graph up there to figure out what those y values are. So we've already figured out that at 4 it's 6. What's the velocity at 2? 9. So we're going to do 6 minus 9 over 4 minus 2, which gives us negative 3/2. And because it's slope, we're finding acceleration, so it's feet per second squared. Anytime that you have acceleration, it's always like the distance divided by the time squared. So there's one more unit. Okay, number 5's tricky. Is there a time in the interval 2 to 4 such that the derivative of velocity is going to equal negative 3/2? We just found out that between 4 and 2, the slope is negative 3/2. So is there a time between 2 and 4 that the slope is going to equal negative 3/2? Look at the graph. So here's 2 and here's 4. And if I connect and the negative 3/2 is there, is there a time between there that the slope is going to be negative 3/2? What makes that not work on this problem? It's not differentiable. The fact that it's not differentiable at 3 makes that not be true. On the other problem, it was continuous and differentiable. This one is not. So, no, not differentiable at x equals 3. It's just going to be at 5. And your explanation, you can say that v of t changes positive to negative, or if you can write a sentence about area and how that the biggest area up until 5, that's why that would be located that way. Either way is fine for your explanation. Okay, so we looked at a velocity table. We looked at a velocity graph. Now we're going to look at a velocity equation. At t equals 0 is the particle moving to the right or to the left. So when it was a table, I looked at the velocity on the table. When it was the graph, I looked to see what the y value was. How am I going to figure it out on this equation? And technically, I think this would be a non-calculator question, so it's not a question where you would put it in the calculator. What do I need to know? I need to know the derivative. I need to know what velocity is. So I'm going to find the velocity. And I'm going to plug in 0 to figure out if the velocity is positive or negative. So I got that the velocity was 9. So is it moving right or left?
It's moving right.
Okay, number 2. At t equals 1, is the velocity of the particle increasing or decreasing? So it's not asking me, is the slope bigger or smaller? It's asking you about, is the velocity increasing or decreasing? So when I say velocity is increasing or decreasing, what we're talking about?
Acceleration.
Acceleration, the derivative of velocity. So we've got to find acceleration. which is what? Just the derivative. So what would the acceleration? Okay. And then we're going to plug in the 1 there. So you get -6. So acceleration's negative. So what does that mean? Velocity is decreasing. All right, number 3, find all values for which the particle is moving to the left. Okay, so think about a velocity graph. Maybe you can think about the original one that we had a minute ago. If I were trying to figure out when it was moving to the left, what would I want to know? When the velocity is below the x-axis? Well, if I could figure out when it touches the x-axis, that will give me an indication of when it's getting ready to go below the x-axis, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take velocity, which I know is the 3t squared minus 12t plus 9. And I'm going to set that equal to 0 and try to solve it. I think if you factor it, you can, I'm just going to go ahead and factor it quickly. You can factor out a 3, and then when you factor the rest of it, you get t minus 3 and t minus 1. So let's make a number line here. Let's plug some values into that. So let's plug in 0, you get a positive. Plug in 2, it's a negative. Plug in 4, it's a positive. So when would the velocity be moving to the left? From 1 to 3. And your reason is velocity is negative. Now, if you're looking at your calculator, if it were not a non-calculator question, you could just find when it was below the x-axis, and it'll show you that on the calculator. Okay, here's more math here. Number 4, find the total distance traveled by the particle over the time interval 0 to 5. Okay, I don't know exactly what the graph looks like, but I know that it's moving to the left from 1 to 3. So I know that the graph is above the x-axis until 1, and then it's below the x-axis from 1 to 3, and then it's above the x-axis after 3. So if I'm trying to find the total distance, what is it that I would do? And on this one, I'm going to use the calculator. But
1 to 3.
I would have to find 1 to 3. I'd have to find 3 to 5, and what would happen with 3 to 5? Or wait a minute. Sorry. I'd have to find 0 to 1.
Yeah. You subtract 1 to 3.
And then 1 to 3 is going to come out to be negative. But see, the question says find total distance. I don't want that negative, so I've got to make it positive. And then I would go from 3 to 5. It'll be positive as well. So whatever the graph looks like, I'm going to find those 3 parts, and I'm going to add them together and change the negative one to positive. If it would have said find the change in position from 0 to 5, I would just find the integral from 0 to 5. Okay? But in this case, I can't do that because it wants the total distance, so I've got to add each of those together. Okay? So use your calculator and do that. Like you're supposed to get 4 for that, you're supposed to get 4 for that, and you're supposed to get 20 for that one. So I think you're supposed to get 28. On that one, you just need to be careful and make sure what they're asking about. Like, since it said total distance, that negative part I had to make it positive. And I'll tell you one more thing. There is another way that you can do that in the calculator without having to separate it. You could do the integral of the absolute value of velocity from 0 to 5. And what it does is it takes the part that's underneath the x-axis and flips it up, and then makes all those little parts positive, and you don't have to find out where it changes. You could just do it all as one thing, as long as you put as long as you put velocity around absolute value. There's going to be some times where that's going to be really, really helpful. So I wanted you to know that you could do the absolute value of velocity, and absolute value of velocity just changes everything below the x-axis to above. Makes it a little bit easier.